Christopher Mason stood at the window of his penthouse office, looking down at the city lights below. Everyone knew him as the ruthless CEO of Mason Industries, but tonight something was different. His assistant had just handed him an invitation to his high school reunion, and for the first time in 15 years, thoughts of his mother filled his mind. "Mr. Mason, your next appointment is here," his assistant called through the intercom. "Send them in," he said, straightening his expensive tie. The merger he was working on would make him even richer, but lately money didn't bring him the same satisfaction it once did. The meeting went like all the others, people eager to please him, afraid to upset him. Christopher had worked hard to create this image. He'd come from nothing, grown up in a tiny apartment with his mother working 3 jobs to keep food on the table. The memory of those days still made him uncomfortable. That evening, as his driver took him home, Christopher noticed a commotion near a homeless shelter. He usually ignored such things, but something made him look closer. An elderly woman was being helped into the shelter, her silver hair tangled and dirty. "Stop the car," he ordered suddenly. "Sir?" the driver asked, surprised. "I said stop." Christopher's voice was sharp. The car pulled over and he got out, not caring that his Italian shoes were touching the dirty sidewalk. He walked toward the shelter, his heart pounding. The woman reminded him so much of, but it couldn't be. His mother was fine, he'd made sure of that, hadn't he? He'd sent money every month for years, until one day the checks started coming back. He'd been too busy with acquisitions and mergers to look into it. As he got closer, the woman turned slightly, and Christopher felt his world stop. Those eyes, he'd know them anywhere. They were the same eyes that had watched him graduate high school, the same eyes that had cried when he left home. "Mom?" His voice cracked. She looked up, and recognition flooded her tired face. "Christopher, is it really you?" He rushed forward, not caring who saw him. His mother was wearing clothes from a donation bin, her hands rough from exposure. How long had she been living like this? "What happened?" he demanded, taking off his coat to wrap around her shoulders. "I sent you money. You were supposed to be taken care of." Evelyn Mason touched his face gently, her smile still as warm as he remembered. "The money you sent, I gave it away." "What?" Christopher couldn't understand. "Why would you do that?" "Because others needed it more," she said simply. "Young mothers, like I once was, trying to raise their children alone. When the shelter where I volunteered started struggling, I couldn't just watch it close. Those families needed help." Christopher felt tears forming in his eyes. While he'd been building his empire, his mother had been giving everything away to help others. She'd ended up homeless because she couldn't stand to see others suffer. "Why didn't you tell me?" he asked, his voice breaking. "Why didn't you ask for more?" Evelyn touched his cheek, her hands cold but gentle. "Because you worked so hard to never be poor again. I didn't want you to know I was still living that way. I wanted you to be proud of what you'd become." Christopher looked at his mother, really looked at her. She had sacrificed everything, first for him and then for strangers. While he'd been focused on making millions, she'd been focused on making a difference. "I'm taking you home," he said firmly, helping her stand. "The shelter needs me," she protested weakly. "Then we'll help the shelter," Christopher said. "But you're never spending another night on the streets. Never again." As he helped his mother into his car, Christopher felt something inside him change. He'd spent 15 years running from poverty, building walls around his heart. But his mother, with nothing to her name, had given everything away out of love. Inside the car, Evelyn looked around at the leather seats with a small smile. "You've done well for yourself." Christopher took her hand, noticing how thin it had become. "I thought I had, but you're the one who's rich, Mom. You've got a heart of gold, and I forgot what that was like." As they drove away from the shelter, Christopher made a silent vow. He would make things right, not just with his mother, but with the world. He had the money and power to make real changes, to help people the way his mother had been doing all along. His phone buzzed with messages about the merger, about meetings and contracts. For the first time in years, Christopher ignored them all. Tonight, he had found something much more valuable than any business deal. He had found his mother, and with her the part of himself he'd lost along the way. The ride to Christopher's penthouse was quiet. Evelyn kept looking out the window, her hands folded neatly in her lap despite her worn clothes. Christopher couldn't stop glancing at her, afraid she might disappear if he looked away too long. "Your building is so tall," Evelyn said as they pulled up to the entrance. "You always did. Dream big." The doorman's eyes widened when he saw them, but one sharp look from Christopher kept him from saying anything. In the elevator, Christopher noticed how his mother tried to stand straight despite her obvious exhaustion. "Here we are," he said, opening the door to his home. The penthouse was huge, with floor-to-ceiling windows showing off the city lights. But now seeing it through his mother's eyes, it felt cold and empty. "Let me show you to your room," he said quickly. "You can take a shower and I'll find you something clean to wear." "Christopher," Evelyn touched his arm, stopping him. "I can't stay here." "Of course you can," he said firmly. "This is your home now. The shelter needs volunteers for breakfast tomorrow. Those children count on having a warm meal before school." Christopher felt something in his chest tighten. Even now she was thinking of others. "I'll send someone to help at the shelter. Right now you need to rest." While his mother showered, Christopher made some calls. Within an hour, his personal shopper had delivered several sets of clothes in his mother's size. He ordered his housekeeper to prepare a late dinner, then sat down to think. The bathroom door opened, and Evelyn came out wearing the simple robe he'd left for her. Her silver hair was clean now, falling past her shoulders. Without the dirt and fatigue of the streets, she looked more like the mother he remembered. "You didn't have to buy me clothes," she said, seeing the packages on the bed. "Yes, I did." Christopher's voice was firm. "Mom, how long were you living on the streets?" Evelyn sat on the edge of the bed, running her hand over the soft comforter. "A few months, maybe. After the shelter lost its funding, we all tried to make do, but there were so many families needing help." "Why didn't you call me?" The words burst out before he could stop them. "You were building your life," she said simply. "The newspapers were always talking about your success. I didn't want to be a burden." "A burden?" Christopher's voice cracked. "Mom, you raised me alone. You worked 3 jobs so I could go to college. How could you ever be a burden?" "That was my job as your mother," she said, smiling softly. "Parents are supposed to help their children fly, not clip their wings." Christopher sat beside her on the bed. "Tell me about the shelter. What happened?" Evelyn's eyes lit up as she talked about the families she helped, the children she read to, the young mothers she mentored. She told him about using his money to fix the shelter's roof, to buy school supplies, to ensure the food pantry was always stocked. "When the building owner decided to sell, we couldn't match the developer's offer," she finished quietly. "We had 2 weeks to clear everyone out." "Where did all the families go?" "Some found other shelters. Some—" Her voice trailed off, and Christopher knew they had ended up on the streets just like his mother. "The developer," Christopher said slowly. "Was it Bradford Properties?" Evelyn nodded. "How did you know?" Christopher stood up, his hands clenched. "Because I'm the one who bought the building. It's part of a development project downtown. I never even looked at what was there before." The silence in the room was heavy. Christopher felt sick. His own business decisions had put his mother on the streets, and he hadn't even known. "It's not your fault," Evelyn said gently. "You didn't know." "I should have known." Christopher's voice was harsh. "I should have checked where you were, what you were doing. Instead, I just sent money and pretended that was enough. Come here." Evelyn patted the bed beside her. Christopher sat down, feeling like a little boy again. "You did what you thought was right. We both did. Now we have a chance to do better. I'm going to fix this," Christopher promised. "The shelter, the families, everything. One step at a time," Evelyn said, yawning. "Tonight I think we both need some rest." Christopher helped his mother into bed, tucking her in like she used to do for him. As he turned to leave, her voice stopped him. "Christopher, thank you for stopping tonight, for seeing me." He turned back, tears in his eyes. "I should have seen you a long time ago, Mom, but I promise, I'm seeing you now." That night, Christopher sat in his office for hours, looking through the development plans for the shelter property. His phone kept ringing. Board members, investors, his assistant trying to remind him about tomorrow's meetings. He ignored them all. Instead, he pulled up property records, shelter statistics, homelessness reports. The more he read, the more he realized how blind he'd been. His mother hadn't just been helping a few people. She'd been holding together an entire community that he had nearly destroyed. Finally, as dawn began to break over the city, Christopher made a decision. He'd built his empire thinking only of profits. Now it was time to build something his mother could be proud of. But first he had to face the board of directors and tell them their newest development project was about to take a very different direction. The next morning, Christopher's executive boardroom was filled with tension. The board members shifted uncomfortably in their leather chairs as he stood at the head of the table, his mother's story still fresh in his mind. "You want to do what?" Robert Bradford, his biggest investor, asked in disbelief. "I'm canceling the downtown development project," Christopher repeated firmly. "Oh, we're going to rebuild the shelter instead. Make it bigger, better." "Have you lost your mind?" Bradford's face was turning red. "That property is worth millions. The retail complex we planned will bring in huge profits." "There are some things more important than profits," Christopher said, thinking of his mother sleeping safely in his penthouse. "Since when?" Patricia Chen, another board member, asked. "You're the one who always says business isn't about charity." Christopher looked around the table. These people had been his allies, chosen because they shared his ruthless approach to business. Now they looked like strangers. "Things have changed," he said simply. "The shelter stays. We'll call for a vote," Bradford threatened. "You may be CEO, but you don't have absolute power here." "Actually, I do." Christopher pulled out a folder. "I've been buying back shares quietly over the past few years. As of last month, I own 51% of Mason Industries. The shelter project goes forward." The boardroom erupted in angry voices. Christopher let them argue, his mind already on his next steps. He needed to find the families who had been displaced, bring back the shelter staff, rebuild what had been lost. His assistant poked her head in. "Mr. Mason, your mother is here." The board members fell silent as Evelyn walked in. She was wearing one of her new outfits, simple but elegant. Her silver hair was neatly styled, but she still had that gentle presence that could calm a room. "I'm sorry to interrupt," she said, "but I brought something you need to see." She laid a worn notebook on the table. "These are all the families who used the shelter. Their stories, their needs, their dreams. Before you decide anything, you should know who you're affecting." Bradford snorted. "This is business, ma'am. We can't make decisions based on sob stories." "Why, Tot?" Evelyn's voice was quiet but firm. "Every number in your spreadsheets represents real people. Mothers working 3 jobs just like I did. Children who just need a chance, like Christopher once was." The room fell silent. Christopher felt pride swell in his chest as his mother continued. "Did you know we had a job training program at the shelter? Single mothers learning computer skills, fathers learning trades. Many of them found good jobs, moved into their own homes. They just needed someone to believe in them." Patricia Chen picked up the notebook, starting to read. Her face softened as she turned the pages. "Maria Rodriguez," she read aloud. 3 children, escaped domestic violence, learned bookkeeping at the shelter. Now works at my accounting firm," Evelyn finished. "She's one of their best employees." One by one, the board members passed the notebook around. Christopher watched their faces change as they read the stories his mother had carefully documented. "We could expand the job training program," Patricia said slowly. "Partner with local businesses. The retail space we planned." Another board member added, "We could reserve jobs for shelter residents." Bradford stood up angrily. "This is ridiculous. I'm selling my shares." "I'll buy them," Christopher said calmly. "At market price plus 10%. After Bradford stormed out, the mood in the room shifted. Board members started offering suggestions, thinking of ways to make the shelter project work. Christopher's mother sat quietly, a small smile on her face. Later in his office, Christopher found his mother looking out at the city. "You didn't have to come today," he said. "Yes, I did." She turned to face him. "You needed to remember why we're doing this." The board members who stayed, they're actually excited about the project now. "Because you let them see the people behind the numbers," Evelyn said, "just like you needed to see me to remember what really matters." Christopher hugged his mother, breathing in the familiar scent of her perfume. one of the small luxuries he'd insisted she accept. "We need to find everyone," he said. "All the families who were displaced. Bring them back." "We will," Evelyn promised. "But first, you need to come with me." "Where?" "To serve breakfast at the shelter where I've been staying. It's time you met the people you're going to help." Christopher looked at his schedule for the day. Meetings, conference calls, business lunches. "Give me 5 minutes to change," he said, reaching for his phone to clear his calendar. That morning, Christopher Mason, CEO of Mason Industries, served breakfast to homeless families. He learned their names, heard their stories, and saw firsthand what his mother had been trying to tell him all along. And in that humble shelter dining room, wearing an apron and serving pancakes, he felt more successful than he ever had in his boardroom. The morning at the shelter changed everything for Christopher. As he served breakfast alongside his mother, he met Maria Rodriguez, the woman who had learned bookkeeping through the shelter's program. Her 3 children sat nearby, doing homework before school. "Mrs. Mason was my angel," Maria told Christopher, her eyes filling with tears. "When I came here, I had nothing. No job, no hope. She didn't just give me food and shelter. She gave me a future." Christopher watched his mother move through the breakfast line, knowing everyone's names, asking about job interviews and school tests. She was more at home here than she'd ever looked in his fancy penthouse. "Your mother," Maria continued, "she used her own money to pay for my bookkeeping courses. She said it was from her son, but I know now it was her choice to help me." The revelation hit Christopher hard. His mother hadn't just given away his money. She'd made sure everyone thought it came from him. She'd been protecting his reputation even while living on the streets. Later that morning, a young man approached Christopher. He looked about 20, wearing clean but worn clothes. "I'm Tommy," he said nervously. "Your mom, she helped me get my GED last year. Said her son would be proud to see another young man getting an education." More stories emerged throughout the day. An elderly woman who needed medicine she couldn't afford. A family whose car broke down, leaving them unable to get to work. Each time Evelyn had helped, always saying the money came from her successful son. "Mom," Christopher called her aside. "Why did you tell everyone I was helping them?" Evelyn straightened his apron with a mother's touch. "Because I knew the man you could become. I just needed to give you time to find him yourself." That afternoon, Christopher called an emergency meeting, not in his boardroom, but in the shelter's dining room. Board members sat at plastic tables, alongside shelter residents, listening to their stories firsthand. "We're not just going to rebuild the old shelter," Christopher announced. "We're going to create something new. A place that doesn't just provide beds and meals, but real opportunities for change." He unveiled his new plans. The development would include affordable housing units, a job training center, a daycare facility, and spaces for small businesses run by shelter graduates like Maria. "This isn't charity," he explained to his board members. "It's investment in human potential. Every person here has something to offer. They just need a chance to prove it." Patricia Chen, who had been quiet all afternoon, suddenly spoke up. "My mother was a single parent too," she said softly. "We were never homeless, but we came close a few times. I want to head the job training program." Other board members began offering their expertise. A retired teacher volunteered to oversee the education programs. A local business owner promised to provide internships. Watching it all, Evelyn squeezed her son's hand. "See? Everyone has good in their hearts. Sometimes they just need permission to show it." That evening, as Christopher drove his mother home, she asked to stop by her old spot near the shelter. "Why?" he asked, worried she was thinking of going back. "Because," she said with a gentle smile, "there are others still out there who need help. We can't forget them." They found 3 people huddled in the alley, a young woman and her 2 small children. The woman shrank back in fear until she saw Evelyn. "Mrs. Mason," she said in disbelief. "We thought you were gone." "Sarah," Evelyn said warmly, hugging the young woman, "I told you I'd come back. This is my son, Christopher. We're going to help you." Christopher didn't hesitate. Within an hour, Sarah and her children were settled in a hotel suite with promises of a place in the new shelter program. "You're really Mrs. Mason's son?" Sarah asked as they got them settled. "She always said you had a good heart." "I'm learning." Christopher replied, watching his mother tuck the children into bed. "I'm learning from the best." That night, back at the penthouse, Christopher found his mother in the kitchen making hot chocolate, just like she used to when he was small. "You've had quite a day," she said, sliding a mug toward him. "I've been thinking," he said, warming his hands around the mug. "The company has properties all over the country." "Yes? Each one could have a program like this. We could help people. Everywhere, not just here." Evelyn's eyes filled with tears. "Now that sounds like my son. The one I always knew you could be." "I wasted so much time," Christopher said regretfully. "All those years chasing money when I could have been doing this." "Nothing is wasted if you learn from it," his mother said, wisely. "You needed to build your success so you could help others find theirs." As they sat drinking hot chocolate, Christopher began making plans. Tomorrow, he would start looking at other properties, other cities where they could expand their program. But tonight, he just wanted to sit with his mother, making up for lost time. Outside, the city lights twinkled, and somewhere in a comfortable hotel room, a family slept safely because two people, a mother and son, had remembered what really mattered in life. News of Christopher Mason's shelter project spread quickly through the business community. Not everyone was happy about it. Robert Bradford, the board member who had stormed out, was now actively working against them. "Mason's lost his mind," Bradford told reporters. "He's throwing away millions on homeless people when his shareholders deserve better returns." Christopher was in his office reviewing plans for the new shelter when his assistant rushed in. "Sir, you need to see this." She handed him a tablet showing Bradford on the morning news. "I filed a shareholder lawsuit," Bradford was saying. "Mason's personal feelings about his homeless mother are affecting his business judgment. The shareholders deserve protection." Christopher's hands tightened on the tablet. He had expected opposition, but bringing his mother into it was a low blow. "Don't watch that garbage," Evelyn said from the doorway. She had taken to visiting the office regularly, bringing a human touch to the corporate environment. "He's just angry because you proved him wrong. He's trying to stop the project, Mum. He's gathered support from some smaller shareholders. Then we'll fight back," Evelyn said simply. She pulled out her worn notebook. "Remember Maria? She's organized all the shelter graduates. They want to tell their stories." That afternoon, Christopher called a press conference, but instead of defending himself, he let others speak. Maria stepped up first, professional in her business suit, her children beside her. "5 years ago, I was running from an abusive husband with 3 kids and nowhere to go," she told the cameras. "The shelter saved us. Mrs. Mason's program gave me job training. Today I'm a certified accountant. My kids are in good schools. We own our apartment." Tommy, the young man who got his GED, spoke next. "I was a high school dropout living on the streets. Now I'm in community college, working part-time and volunteering at the shelter. That's what this program does. It gives people a chance to change their lives." More success stories followed. Sarah, the young mother they'd found in the alley, spoke about her first week in the temporary shelter. "My kids are safe," she said, crying. "They're warm and fed. I have a job interview tomorrow. This isn't a handout, it's hope." The news coverage shifted. Instead of questioning Christopher's business judgment, reporters began focusing on the program's success stories. Other business leaders called, wanting to know how they could start similar programs. But Bradford wasn't finished. He scheduled a rival press conference for the next day, promising to reveal the truth about the Mason family. That night, Evelyn found Christopher working late in his home office. "You need to rest," she said, bringing him tea. "Bradford's going to try to hurt you tomorrow," Christopher said worriedly. "He's been digging into your past." "Let him," Evelyn said calmly. "I've never done anything I'm ashamed of." "But, Christopher," she took his hand, "when you were little and the other kids made fun of your second-hand clothes, what did I tell you?" He smiled slightly. "That what matters isn't what people say about you, but what you do for others." Exactly. Bradford can say what he wants. The truth will speak louder. The next morning, Bradford held his press conference. He revealed that Evelyn had once declared bankruptcy, had worked as a cleaning lady, had lived in low-income housing. "Is this the kind of person who should influence a billion-dollar company?" he demanded. The response wasn't what he expected. People began sharing their own stories of hardship, of mothers who had sacrificed everything for their children. Proud like Evelyn started trending on social media. Christopher's phone rang. It was Patricia Chen. "Turn on the TV," she said. "Channel 7. He found the station just in time to see Maria Rodriguez standing at a podium, surrounded by other shelter graduates. "Yes, Evelyn Mason worked as a cleaning lady," Maria was saying. "She worked 3 jobs to put her son through college, and when she had money, she gave it away to help others. If that's supposed to make us think less of her, you don't understand what true wealth is." The cameras cut to Bradford, who was losing his composure. "This is about business," he shouted, "about profits." "No," came a quiet voice. Evelyn had arrived at the press conference. "This is about people. Every number in your spreadsheets is a human being. Every profit margin represents someone's life." She walked to the podium, her simple dignity a stark contrast to Bradford's angry red face. "Yes, I was poor," she said clearly. "Yes, I worked hard jobs. Yes, I declared bankruptcy once, because I chose to pay for my son's education instead of my own bills. And yes, when I had money, I gave it away, because that's what you do when you understand that true wealth isn't about what you have, but what you share." The room erupted in applause. Bradford stormed out, his attack backfiring completely. Later that day, Christopher received calls from major shareholders. Instead of opposing the shelter project, they wanted to increase its funding. Other companies began reaching out about starting their own programs. "You see," Evelyn said as they watched the evening news together, "sometimes what looks like an attack is really an opportunity to show people a better way." Christopher hugged his mother tightly. "I love you, Mum. I'm sorry I ever forgot what you taught me." "You never forgot," she said softly. "You just needed a reminder. Now how about we go serve dinner at the shelter? Sarah's kids are expecting their story time." As they drove to the shelter, Christopher realized something important. In trying to destroy them, Bradford had actually made their message stronger. Sometimes, he thought, watching his mother greet the shelter residents with warm hugs, the best revenge is simply doing good and letting the world see why it matters. The defeat of Bradford's lawsuit brought unexpected attention to the shelter project. News crews from across the country wanted to interview Evelyn and Christopher, but Evelyn had other priorities. "Jenny's daughter is sick," she told Christopher one morning, pulling on her coat. "I promise to watch her other children while she takes the baby to the doctor." Christopher looked up from his laptop. "Mom, we have that interview with national news today in an hour." "You handle it," she said, already heading for the door. "Some things are more important than publicity." She was right, of course. She usually was. Christopher rescheduled the interview and went with her to Jenny's small apartment in the temporary housing complex they'd set up. Jenny was a young mother who'd fled an abusive marriage with 3 children. Her baby, Emma, had been running a high fever all night. "Mrs. Mason," Jenny said with relief when they arrived. "Thank you for coming. I didn't know who else to call." "Go take care of that baby," Evelyn said, already gathering Jenny's other children around her. "Christopher will drive you to the hospital." "I will." Christopher hadn't planned on that. His mother gave him a look he remembered from childhood. "Yes, you will. Jenny doesn't have a car, and Emma needs to see a doctor now." The drive to the hospital was quiet at first. Jenny held her feverish baby close, worry etched on her face. "I can't afford the emergency room," she whispered. "Don't worry about that," Christopher said firmly. "I'll take care of it." At the hospital, Christopher saw firsthand what his mother had been trying to tell him about the healthcare system. The wait was long, the forms were confusing, and everyone wanted insurance information first and foremost. "I'm paying cash," Christopher told the intake nurse, "and we need to see a doctor now." 4 hours later, Emma's fever was down, and they had antibiotics for her ear infection. But Christopher couldn't stop thinking about all the other families who didn't have someone to help them. "Mum," he said that evening, finding her making soup in his penthouse kitchen, "we need to add something to the shelter project." "Oh?" "A health clinic. Free care for families who need it." Evelyn smiled, stirring the soup. "I was wondering when you'd think of that." "You knew." "I knew you'd see the need once you experienced it yourself. That's why I sent you with Jenny today." Christopher shook his head. amazed at his mother's wisdom. "How you planned this?" "I plan a lot of things," she said with a twinkle in her eye. "Now take this soup over to Jenny's place. Her other children will be hungry." The next few weeks were a whirlwind of activity. Christopher worked with local hospitals to set up the clinic. Patricia Chen discovered her sister was a pediatrician, looking for a more meaningful way to practice medicine. "She's tired of the corporate healthcare system," Patricia explained. "She wants to help people who really need it." The clinic started. Small, just 2 exam rooms in a converted office space. But word spread quickly. Families who hadn't seen a doctor in years finally got medical care. Children got vaccinations and checkups. Pregnant mothers got prenatal care. One evening, Christopher found his mother sitting with a young woman in the clinic waiting room. "This is Lisa," Evelyn said. "She's going to be our first nursing student." Christopher looked confused. "Tell him your story," Evelyn encouraged. Lisa twisted her hands nervously. "I was a nursing assistant before my husband lost his job and we lost our home. Mrs. Mason says, she says you might help me finish my nursing degree." "Mom," Christopher raised an eyebrow. "We need nurses for the clinic," Evelyn said practically. "Lisa needs a chance to finish her education. It makes perfect sense." And somehow it did. Within months they had a program in place. People from the shelter who had medical experience or interest could train to work in the clinic. They provided childcare, flexible schedules, and full scholarships. "You're building more than a clinic," Dr. Chen, Patricia's sister, told Christopher. "You're building a community of healers who understand exactly what our patients are going through." The impact spread beyond just healthcare. Seeing Lisa work toward her nursing degree inspired others at the shelter to dream bigger. Maria Rodriguez started teaching basic accounting to other residents. Tommy tutored kids after his college classes. "It's like a ripple effect," Christopher told his mother one night. They were having their usual evening hot chocolate, a tradition he'd grown to treasure. "Every person we help goes on to help others. That's how real change happens," Evelyn said. "Not from the top down, but from within. People just need to know someone believes in them." "Like you believed in me," Christopher said softly. "I never stopped believing in you," she replied, "even when you forgot to believe in yourself." The next morning, Christopher called a meeting with his development team. The plans for the new shelter complex were good, but they needed to be bigger. "We need more classroom space," he told them. "A real medical wing, not just a clinic, and housing for students in our training programs." "That's going to cost a lot more," his project manager warned. Christopher thought about Jenny's sick baby, about Lisa's dreams of being a nurse, about all the people still waiting for their chance. "Some things are worth every penny," he said, echoing his mother's wisdom. "Now let's make it happen." That evening, walking through the temporary shelter, Christopher saw Lisa studying her nursing textbooks while her children did their homework. Beside her, in the kitchen, Maria was explaining budget basics to a group of residents. Tommy was reading to Jenny's kids while she rested with baby Emma. "You've created something beautiful here," Evelyn said, appearing beside him. "We've created it," Christopher corrected her, "and we're just getting started." Looking around at all the lives being transformed, Christopher realized that his mother had taught him the most valuable business lesson of all. True wealth multiplies when you share it, and the best investments are the ones you make in people. The vast success of the shelter project had changed Christopher in ways he never expected. He smiled more, laughed easier, and found joy in the simple moments with his mother and their growing shelter family. But life had more surprises in store. It started one rainy Tuesday when Dr. Rachel Chen, Patricia's sister, came running into his office without knocking. "We need you at the clinic," she said breathlessly. "Now." Christopher followed her without question. At the clinic he found chaos. A pipe had burst in the ceiling, flooding 2 exam rooms and the waiting area. Families huddled in the dry corner while maintenance tried to stop the water. "We can't close," Rachel said desperately. "We have 30 children scheduled for vaccinations today." Christopher looked around, then pulled out his phone. Within an hour, the main conference room at Mason Industries had been transformed into a temporary clinic. Security guards helped transport medical supplies, and office staff volunteered to help with paperwork. Among the waiting families, Christopher noticed a woman who looked familiar. She was probably in her early 30s with kind eyes and a gentle way of calming the nervous children around her. "That's Hannah," his mother said, appearing beside him as she always seemed to do. "She's a teacher, or was before everything fell apart." Christopher watched as Hannah organized the waiting children into a story circle, keeping them entertained while they waited for their shots. She had a natural gift for it. "She lost her job when her school cut funding," Evelyn continued. "Then, her apartment. She's been at the shelter for 2 weeks, but she still spends every day helping others." Later, when the clinic crisis was handled, Christopher found Hannah helping clean up the conference room. "You don't have to do that," he said. "We have cleaning staff." "Everyone should help where they can," she replied simply. Then she looked at him properly for the first time, and something passed between them, a spark of recognition, of understanding. "You're Mrs. Mason's son," she said softly. "She talks about you all the time. Good things, I hope. She says you have a good heart. I'm starting to see what she means." That evening, Christopher couldn't stop thinking about Hannah. He found his mother in their usual spot. In the kitchen, "Tell me more about Hannah," he tried to say casually. Evelyn hid her smile behind her hot chocolate mug. "She has a master's degree in education, specialized in working with children who have learning difficulties. The new shelter will have a learning center," Christopher mused. "We'll need qualified teachers." "Yes, we will," Evelyn agreed, her eyes twinkling. "Maybe you should discuss that with her. Over dinner, perhaps." "Mom." "What?" "I'm just thinking about the children's education," but there was more to deal with than potential romance. The burst pipe at the clinic had exposed a bigger problem. Their temporary facilities weren't adequate for the growing number of people they were helping. "We need to speed up construction on the new building," Christopher told his team. "Winter's coming, and we can't risk more failures in the temporary space." The construction manager looked worried. "We're already working as fast as we can, unless what? Unless you're willing to pay for triple shifts. It would cost a lot more, but we could have the main building ready before winter." Christopher didn't hesitate. "Do it." That decision meant longer hours and more work for everyone. Christopher found himself at the construction site daily, overseeing progress. Often he'd find Hannah there too, offering suggestions about classroom layouts and learning spaces. "The library should face east," she told him one day. "Morning light is best for reading." "You've given this a lot of thought," he said, admiring her passion. "Your mother encouraged me to dream big," she replied. "She said if I could imagine it, you could build it." Christopher laughed. "She's quite the matchmaker, isn't she?" Hannah blushed slightly. "She loves you very much. She just wants you to be happy." "I am happy," Christopher realized. "Happier than I've ever been." Their conversations became a daily occurrence. Hannah would share her ideas for the learning center, and Christopher found himself looking forward to their talks more and more. One evening, he found his mother looking at old photographs in her room. "What's that?" he asked. She held up a faded picture. It showed a much younger Evelyn holding a small boy, Christopher, at about age 5. "You were helping your kindergarten teacher. That day," she remembered. "You came home so excited about making a difference." Christopher sat beside her. "I'd forgotten about that." "You always had a good heart," she said softly. "You just got lost for a while, but now you're finding your way back. With a lot of help," he added, hugging her. "Speaking of help," Evelyn said innocently, "Hannah mentioned she's never been to that little Italian restaurant down the street." "Mom, I'm just saying she works very hard. She deserves a nice dinner out." Christopher shook his head, laughing. But the next day he found himself asking Hannah to dinner. Her smile when she said yes made his heart skip a beat. "Just remember," his mother told him later, "real love grows from kindness and understanding. You've learned to be kind again. The rest will follow naturally." Looking around at the growing shelter community, at Lisa studying nursing, at Maria teaching accounting, at Tommy tutoring children, and at Hannah planning a school that would change lives, Christopher realized his mother had given him more than just his life back. She'd given him a chance to be part of something bigger than himself. And maybe, just maybe, she'd also helped him find someone to share it with. Christopher's first dinner with Hannah changed everything. They talked for hours at the little Italian restaurant, sharing stories about their lives and dreams. Hannah told him about her years teaching, her eyes lighting up when she described helping struggling students succeed. "There was this one boy," she said, twirling pasta on her fork. "Everyone had given up on him, but I knew he just needed someone to believe in him." By the end of the year, he was reading at grade level. Christopher watched her talk, mesmerized by her passion. "You really love teaching, don't you?" "It's not just teaching," Hannah explained. "It's showing someone they matter, that they can succeed, like your mother did for me at the shelter." The mention of his mother made Christopher smile. "She has a way of seeing the best in people. She sees the best in you," Hannah said softly. "She never stops talking about her wonderful son." Christopher felt his face grow warm. "I wasn't always wonderful. I lost my way for a while. But you found it again." Hannah reached across the table and touched his hand. "That's what matters." Their dinner lasted until the restaurant was closing. Walking Hannah back to the shelter, Christopher felt like a teenager again, nervous and excited all at once. The next morning, he found his mother waiting in his office with a knowing smile. "Don't say it," he warned, trying not to grin. "Say what?" Evelyn asked innocently. "I just wanted to mention that the Learning Center needs a director." "Mom!" "Someone qualified with teaching experience and a kind heart." Christopher laughed. "You never give up, do you?" "Not when I see something good," she said simply. The shelter construction was moving quickly now with the triple shifts. Christopher spent more time at the site, and somehow Hannah was often there too, reviewing plans for the classrooms and library. One day, they found themselves alone in what would become the main classroom. "Imagine it," Hannah said, gesturing around the empty space. "Desks here, reading corner there, and big windows to let in natural light." "Tell me more," Christopher said, watching her face light up with enthusiasm. "We'll need computers for job training, but also books, lots of books, and a quiet space for children to do homework after school. So many shelter kids fall behind because they don't have a good place to study." Christopher made mental notes, already planning to exceed her wishes, but he kept that to himself for now. The shelter community had noticed their growing closeness. Maria teased Hannah during their accounting lessons, and Tommy would mysteriously disappear whenever Christopher showed up at the temporary learning space, leaving them alone together. Even Dr. Rachel joined the matchmaking. "Hannah's amazing with the children who come to the clinic," she told Christopher. "She has a way of making them feel safe during their checkups. We really should hire her officially." "Does everyone in this place work for my mother?" Christopher joked. "We just want you to be happy," Rachel said with a grin. "Both of you." One evening, Christopher was working late at the construction site when he heard children's voices. Following the sound, he found Hannah sitting on a stack of lumber, reading to Jenny's kids and several others from the shelter. "And the little engine said, 'I think I can,' she read, making train noises that had the children giggling. Christopher stayed in the shadows, watching. Hannah had created a magical moment in the middle of a construction site, helping these children forget their troubles for a while. When the story was finished and the children had gone back to the shelter with Jenny, Christopher stepped forward. "That was beautiful," he said. Hannah jumped slightly, then smiled. "They needed some fun. Construction noise makes it hard to sleep at the shelter sometimes." "I'm sorry about that." "Don't be. The kids love watching the building go up. They say it's like their very own castle being built." Christopher looked at Hannah in the fading light. "Be the director of the learning center." "What?" "We need someone qualified, someone who understands these families because she's been where they are. Someone with a vision for what education can do." Hannah's eyes filled with tears. "Christopher, say yes," he urged. "Help me make this place everything it can be." Instead of answering, Hannah kissed him. It was sweet and perfect and felt like coming home. Someone cleared their throat nearby. They broke apart to find Evelyn standing there, trying to hide her smile. "The children are asking for another story, Hannah," she said. "But I can tell them you're busy." No, I'll come," Hannah said quickly, blushing. She hurried past Evelyn, who definitely winked at her son. "Not a word, Mom," Christopher warned, but he was grinning. "I didn't say anything," Evelyn replied. "But she does make you smile." "I haven't seen you smile like that in years." Christopher hugged his mother. "Thank you." "For what?" for helping me find my way back to who I'm supposed to be, for creating this community that brought Hannah into my life, for everything." Evelyn patted his cheek. "Just be happy, my son. That's all I ever wanted." Later that night, Christopher stood in the empty construction site, imagining the future. Classrooms full of learning, a clinic healing bodies and spirits, homes where families could rebuild their lives, and at the heart of it all, love, the kind his mother had shown him, the kind he was learning to share with Hannah, the kind that could change the world one person at a time. Winter came early that year, bringing bitter cold and heavy snow. The key. Construction crews worked through the storms, racing to finish the main building before Christmas. Christopher spent every spare moment at the site, worried about the families still living in the temporary shelter. One particularly cold morning, he arrived to find Hannah already there, serving hot chocolate to the construction workers. "They're working so hard," she explained, handing him a cup. "I thought they deserved something warm." Christopher took a sip and smiled. "This tastes like your mother's recipe," Hannah finished. "She taught me how to make it just the way you like it." Looking at her in her warm coat, cheeks pink from the cold, Christopher felt his heart swell. Before he could say anything, his phone rang. It was Chai's, the shelter supervisor, calling with bad news. "The heating system's failing," she reported. "We've got space heaters running, but the electricity can't handle much more." Christopher rushed to the temporary shelter, finding his mother already there, organizing people in the community room where it was warmest. "We need to move everyone," he said, seeing his breath in the cold air. "Now." "But where?" Evelyn asked. "The new building isn't ready." Christopher made a quick decision. "The Mason Industries office building. We have 3 empty floors since we consolidated departments." Within hours, a convoy of buses was transporting shelter residents to the corporate offices. Christopher watched as conference rooms became dormitories, break rooms turned into dining areas, and his employees worked alongside shelter residents to make it all happen. "Your board won't like this," Hannah warned as she helped set up cots. "They'll like frozen pipes and lawsuits even less," Christopher replied. But he knew she was right. There would be complaints. He didn't expect those complaints to come from Robert Bradford. His old nemesis had been quiet lately, but now he showed up in the office lobby, looking disgusted. "This is a corporate headquarters, not a homeless shelter," Bradford sneered, watching families carry their belongings through the lobby. "These people need help," Christopher said firmly. "The building has heat and space. That's all that matters." "You're going to regret this," Bradford threatened, stomping out. That evening, as everyone settled into their temporary quarters, Christopher found his mother in what had been the executive dining room, now serving as a communal kitchen. "Look at this," she said proudly, gesturing around the room. The space had been transformed. Families sat at the elegant tables, sharing meals and stories. Children did homework in comfortable leather chairs, while parents attended job training sessions in high-tech conference rooms. Lisa, now well into her nursing program, had set up a first aid station in the corner. Maria was using the business center to teach computer skills. Tommy had organized a study group in the library. It's better than the shelter, Christopher realized. They have everything they need right here. Hannah appeared beside him, carrying a sleeping child. "Jenny's working late at her new job," she explained. "I'm watching Emma for her." Christopher watched Hannah with the sleeping baby and felt something click into place in his heart. This was what mattered, not corner offices or profit margins, but people helping people. "Marry me," he said suddenly. Hannah's eyes widened. Emma stirred slightly but didn't wake. "Christopher," Hannah started. "I mean it," he continued. "I love you. I love how you care about everyone, how you see the best in people, how you've helped make all this possible. Marry me and help me make it even better." "Say yes," Evelyn called from across the room, not even pretending she hadn't been listening. Hannah laughed softly, careful not to wake Emma. "Yes," she whispered. "Of course." "Yes." The room erupted in cheers. Apparently everyone had been listening. Jenny arrived just then, coming to collect Emma, and burst into happy tears when she heard the news. But their celebration was short-lived. Bradford had gone to the media. painting Christopher as an irresponsible CEO who was turning valuable corporate property into a flop house. The next morning's headlines were brutal. Mason Industries, corporate giant or giant shelter. Shareholders question Mason's judgment again. Corporate offices become homeless housing. Christopher was in his office dealing with angry calls when Patricia Chen burst in. "You need to see this," she said, turning on the TV. Bradford was holding another press conference, but this time he wasn't alone. Behind him stood several familiar faces, shelter residents Christopher had helped. "These people will tell you the truth about Christopher Mason," Bradford announced smugly. But then something unexpected happened. Maria Rodriguez stepped to the microphone. "You want the truth?" she said clearly. "The truth is that Christopher Mason and his mother saved my life. They gave me and my children a home when we had nothing. They helped me get education and a job. Now I own my own home and my kids are thriving." One by one, shelter residents stepped forward to tell their stories. Tommy talked about getting his GED and starting college. Jenny spoke about her new job and Emma's recovery. Lisa discussed her nursing studies. Bradford tried to stop them, but the cameras kept rolling as person after person testified about how the Mason Shelter program had changed their lives. Back in his office, Christopher watched in amazement as Bradford's plan backfired spectacularly. His phone started ringing again, but now it was supporters calling to help. "We should do this in every city," one CEO said. "Show us how." Hannah found him still at his desk late that night. "You look tired," she said, massaging his shoulders. "Good. Tired," he replied, pulling her into his lap. "Happy tired." "Your mother's already planning our wedding," she told him, laughing. "She wants to hold it in the new shelter building when it's finished." Christopher smiled. "Perfect, we can celebrate everything at once. New beginnings, new lives, new love." Looking out his office window at the lights of the city, Christopher thought about how much had changed. His corporate office had become a temporary shelter. His business priorities had shifted completely, and his heart had opened in ways he never expected. And through it all, his mother's quiet wisdom had guided him, showing him that true success wasn't about what you had, but about what you gave. "What are you thinking about?" Hannah asked softly. "About how sometimes you have to lose everything to find what really matters," he answered, holding her close. In the converted dining room below, Evelyn watched families preparing for bed, her heart full of joy. Her son had finally found his way home, not to a place but to the person he was always meant to be. Spring arrived early the year the new shelter building was completed. The morning sun sparkled on fresh paint and new windows as Christopher stood in the courtyard, taking it all in. The building was everything they had dreamed of and more, a place of hope, healing, and new beginnings. "It's perfect," Hannah said, squeezing his hand. They were getting married here tomorrow, just as his mother had suggested. The shelter complex had turned out better than anyone imagined. The main building housed not just temporary living spaces, but also the medical clinic, job training center, and Hannah's pride and joy, a state-of-the-art learning center. The surrounding buildings offered transitional apartments where families could stay while getting back on their feet. "Your mother's in the kitchen again," Hannah told him. "She's been baking since dawn." Christopher smiled. Ever since they'd moved, residents back from the corporate offices, his mother had insisted on making the shelter's kitchen feel like home. The smell of her cooking always filled the halls, making everyone feel welcome. "Mr. Mason, Mr. Mason!" Little Emma came running across the courtyard, her dark curls bouncing. She wasn't a sick baby anymore, but a healthy 4-year-old who attended the shelter's preschool program. "Look what I made." She held up a drawing of what looked like a large family. "That's beautiful," Christopher said, kneeling down to her level. "Who are all these people?" "That's you and Miss Hannah," Emma pointed. "And Mrs. Mason and my mom and Maria and Tommy and Lisa and Dr. Rachel and everyone. It's our family." Christopher felt his throat tighten. Emma was right. They had become a family, all of them. Inside the building, the preparations for tomorrow's wedding were in full swing. Residents and staff worked together, hanging decorations and arranging flowers. The ceremony would be held in the community center, followed by a celebration that would include everyone. "Christopher?" His mother's voice called from the kitchen. "Can you come here for a moment?" He found Evelyn surrounded by cooling racks of cookies and cakes, but it wasn't the baking she wanted to show him. "Look who's here," she said softly. Standing nervously by the door was Robert Bradford. He looked different, humbled somehow. "I'll give you two a moment," Evelyn said, wiping her hands on her apron and slipping out. "What are you doing here?" Christopher asked, trying to keep the edge out of his voice. Bradford cleared his throat. "I came to apologize and to ask for help." "Help? My daughter?" Bradford's voice cracked. "She's in trouble. Drugs. She has two small children and she's about to lose them. I didn't know where else to go." Christopher sat down at one of the kitchen tables, gesturing for Bradford to join him. "Tell me everything," he said. By that evening, Bradford's daughter and her children were settled into one of the family rooms. Dr. Rachel had already evaluated them and started making treatment plans. Hannah had enrolled the children in her education program. "Thank you," Bradford said gruffly as he prepared to leave. "I was wrong about this place, about you. Stay for the wedding tomorrow," Christopher found himself saying. "See what we're really building here." The next morning dawned clear and beautiful. The community center had been transformed with flowers and twinkling lights. Residents filled. The seats dressed in their best clothes, many of which had been donated by local businesses. Christopher stood at the front, his heart full as he watched the crowd gather. There was Maria in a smart business suit, her children beside her. Tommy wore his college letterman jacket proudly. Lisa was in her nursing scrubs, having just finished a shift at the clinic. Jenny sat with Emma, who was taking her flower girl duties very seriously. Bradford sat quietly in the back, watching everything with new eyes. The music started, and Hannah appeared in a simple white dress. But it was who walked beside her that brought tears to Christopher's eyes. His mother, in a pale blue dress, escorted Hannah down the aisle. "Who gives this woman?" the minister asked. "We all do," Evelyn answered, her voice clear and strong. "Her shelter family." The ceremony was simple but profound. Christopher and Hannah had written their own vows, promising not just to love each other, but to continue the work they'd started together. "I promise to build not just a home with you," Christopher said, "but to keep building hope for others." "I promise to teach not just in classrooms," Hannah replied, "but to help everyone see their own worth and potential." At the reception, everyone celebrated together. Corporate executives and shelter residents, doctors and patients, teachers and students. All the artificial barriers had melted away. Bradford approached Christopher during the celebration. "I'd like to help," he said. "My company, we could open similar programs in other cities if you'll show us how." "Welcome to the family," Christopher replied, shaking his former enemy's hand. Later that evening, Christopher found his mother sitting quietly in her favorite spot in the kitchen. "Happy?" she asked as he sat beside her. "More than I ever thought possible," he answered. "You knew all along, didn't you, that I needed to find my way back to what really matters?" "A mother always knows her child's heart," Evelyn said softly, "even when they forget it themselves." "The night I found you," Christopher said, taking her hand, "I thought I was saving you, but you were really saving me." "We saved each other," she corrected him, "and now we get to help save others." Hannah joined them, carrying Emma, who had fallen asleep after all the excitement. "Jenny's working late again," she explained. "I told her we'd watch Emma." Christopher looked at his new wife holding the sleeping child, at his mother's gentle smile, at the warmth and love that filled the kitchen. This was what real success felt like. Outside, the shelter lights glowed warmly in the evening darkness, a beacon of hope for anyone who needed it. Inside, a family, much bigger and more diverse than Christopher had ever imagined possible, had come together in love and purpose. "You know what this means," Evelyn said with a twinkle in her eye, watching Hannah with Emma. "Mom," Christopher warned, but he was smiling. "We just got married today. I'm just saying those empty rooms upstairs would make perfect nurseries." Hannah laughed softly, careful not to wake Emma. "One step at a time, Mom," she said, the word Mom falling naturally from her lips. Evelyn beamed at being called Mom by Hannah. "Well, while we're waiting for grandchildren, we have plenty of little ones here who need love." Christopher wrapped his arms around his new family, his wife, his mother, the sleeping child, and felt truly complete. From the depths of that alley, where he'd found his mother, They had built something extraordinary. Not just a shelter, but a home. Not just a program, but a family. Not just a business, but a mission. And it had all started with a mother's sacrifice, a sacrifice that had taught him the greatest lesson of all, that true wealth isn't measured in dollars, but in love shared and lives changed. What next? Hannah asked softly. Christopher smiled, thinking of Bradford's offer to expand the program, of all the other cities where people needed help, of all the lives they could touch. We keep building, he said simply. Together, in the warmth of the shelter kitchen, surrounded by the family he'd found and the love he'd rediscovered, Christopher knew that this was just the beginning of their story.